Yes, sir.
Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Radio Free Cannabis, coming to you from high in the hills of Oakland, California, translated into 195 different languages. We are the voice of the global cannabis freedom movement. Thanks so much for the questions and comments that you've been sending in. Please keep them coming. Also, subscribe to the podcast and remind all of your friends to do the same thing. And of course, support the companies that help this podcast stay alive. Harborside, Homegrown, Liberty Clothing, and there's this new company that I've recently really become enamored with, and I'm wearing one of their bandanas. This is a 100% hemp bandana, and it's like, I just wonder what would happen if all of us all around the world made a commitment to just have, like in the next month or two, one little item in our wardrobe that was made of hemp. Can we all do that? The bandana is a great place to start, maybe. So our tribe's struggle to end cannabis prohibition is now well over a half century old. A great deal of progress has been made over these years, with even more yet to come. Since the beginning, it's largely been an information war. When I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, it was almost impossible to find accurate science and history about cannabis. Most of the old books had been purged from libraries and bookstores, and very few new books were being published. There were only 3 TV networks in the whole country, and no internet. It was much, much easier for the government to control the flow of information than it is today. As a young activist, I had to sneak into university libraries, paw through moldering old card catalogs, roam through miles of stacks to locate ancient and obscure manuscripts. And then, sometimes the relevant pages had been cut right out of them. Research has always been an important part of cannabis activism because we know that we win any fact and evidence-based argument. Governments and the punishment industry know it too. That's why they do everything they can to cloak and hide their nefarious agenda. That's why they've funded thousands of bogus pseudoscience quote-unquote studies designed to show that cannabis causes harm. That is why they have spent billions of dollars on propaganda programs like DARE and Just Say No. That's why they've seen to it that only 13% of U.S. medical schools give their students any instruction in the therapeutic properties of cannabis. Agencies like the Drug Enforcement Administration and the National Institute of Drug Abuse desperately use these and other deceptive devices to maintain their crumbling veneer of credibility, because they know they cannot survive an open debate. Tom Adams is one of our most effective soldiers in this information war. He is an analyst who has spent his career supporting industries that have, over the years, radically expanded consumer access to information. He started with home video, moved on to digital media technologies and the internet, and for the past several years has been the principal analyst at BDS Analytics, an early leader, one of the very earliest leaders in business intelligence for the cannabis market. He carries an incredible wealth of knowledge about the cannabis industry, information that will be of value to entrepreneurs and investors, but also to activists and just lovers of cannabis. When you hear statistics like the 250,000 jobs the industry has produced in the United States, or the hundreds of millions of dollars of tax revenue collected in legal states, Tom is one of the people you can thank for that information. Tom recently launched a new venture of his own, Adams Cannabis Research, which will be focusing on the global cannabis market. Our discussion today, of course, then will range all over the world. By the end of the show, I promise you're going to learn something about cannabis that you've never heard before. I can make that promise because that happens to me every time I sit down with Tom. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be on Radio Free Cannabis.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here. Let's just start, Tom, with telling the audience what a market analyst is. What do you do, and why is it important?
Well, I tell my friends who it's hard to explain to that basically I pretend to be able to predict the future. And actually, don't just pretend, I actually do predict the future, keeping in mind that I'm never going to be right 100%, of course. All you can do is be directionally correct about something like how big will legal spending around the world be in 2025. But just being directionally correct, I have found, is really the key that people in the industry need. Companies can't do their planning without forecasts that are at least that directionally correct. And actually, really, the histories too. Where has the industry been? Where is it today, and where is it going? What are the likely fast growth subsectors? Where's the common wisdom wrong? A super important one, especially in the early days of an industry like this, when the common wisdom is so very often wrong. So companies use the forecast and analysis to plan their futures. Investors use it to allocate capital. Activists use the numbers to argue their points. And regulators, hopefully, use them to structure regulatory regimes that will do more good than harm to society. At least that's our hope.
So, what are some of the specific tools that you use, Tom?
Well, everything from Excel is frankly the key tool. You can use fancier ones, but frankly, laying it all out in spreadsheets is what really makes the trends pop out at you. And really comprehensive Excel models where you, in a market like this, start with the number of patients or adult users and gather whatever information you can through consumer polling about what they're spending on cannabis and what kinds of products they're buying. You could then break down the spending into product types and estimate, look at the price trends around those to figure out how many units of each product type are being sold. You can then look at the cannabinoid content of those units and model it all the way down to the demand for flower, trim, and oil. So that's what I've really been focused on in the couple months since leaving BDSA, is to take what had been just a spending model and take it all the way down to the ground level, literally. The amount of plants being grown and needed to supply the market around the world. So it's been great to get a chance to do that over the last couple of months, and I think we finally have a pretty good view of how the business works at all the levels, from grower to manufacturer to distributor to retailer to the consumer.
Well, we're going to explore your conclusions here. You had the opportunity to be involved really in the very early stages of the analysis of the legal cannabis market here in the United States, got to know that intimately, and now have been taking those talents that you used and using them to take a look at the global cannabis market. So, if you could just walk us through that global market, what does it look like? How big is it? What do you see happening there that's important for us to know about?
Well, many things. Talk about the common wisdom being wrong. Of course, we saw the wreckage of that in some of the results that the Canadians have suffered through in the last in the last 12 months or so. Um, and so, what I really try and strive for in these forecasts is reasonableness, right? That anybody can kind of pick a number. And when you're talking about cannabis, you may end up being right. It's wildly popular with consumers, of course. But the challenge is to figure out what are the reasonable assumptions to make about growth going forward. So I see, in fact, the BDSA's on the website, they've just updated the worldwide legal spending forecast that I helped develop there. And that work was done by the team of really the smartest analysts from my media and technology background that I could convince to take a flyer on this cannabis thing. And the key ones are still there working on this. So, um, so the key findings probably are that, surprisingly to probably a lot of people, the international market is just much, much smaller than people think, but it's growing very quickly. It's the big worldwide picture is changing pretty radically. 5 years ago, in 2015, it was about a $4.6 billion worldwide market, but 97% of that was in the U.S. The bulk of that, frankly, in California, and Canada was a small little 2% of it, with just a medical only market, and the international markets were just 1% of the market at that point, and that's counting pharmaceuticals. There really was no cannabis market, so to speak. It was a cannabinoid market, if you will, and very tiny. So BDSA expects this year that there'll be about 20 billion spent worldwide, about 83% of that now US, 4% Canada, and actually 13% international. So international has come a long way in the last 5 years, as a couple of big countries, Germany, but really just a host of countries. There's now 40 plus countries worldwide that have at least pharmaceuticals and more real cannabis markets. So for 2025, BDSA is suggesting that the $47 billion market at that point will be down to 72% US, 14% Canada, and that's really where the growth is, and that's a key issue because, of course, adult use changes everything. International will still be 14%, so the market's growing stupendously in the mid-20s compound annual growth rate, and international grow with that. But because of all the limitations of being medical only markets, it really won't expand its percentage of the market very much by 2025, which is kind of crazy. So at that point, you'll have Canada at 6.5 billion, and that's 40 million Canadians spending as much as 7.5 billion other people around the world are spending on legal cannabis, critical point, legal cannabis. And 150 million Americans actually will be spending 5 times as much as that 6.5 billion that's being spent in, on the one hand, Canada, on the other hand, the entire rest of the world. So it's really important to keep that kind of context in mind, that as far as revenue growth and business activity and all of that, it's largely about the US, with Canada coming on strong and the international markets really just getting started at this point. But of course, the growth rates are always stupendous overseas because we're talking about a very tiny base of business at this point. So those ratios, the key thing that's occurred to me in doing all this work is that this, of course, has little to do with the relative popularity of cannabis around the world, and everything to do with the pace of legalization, which is just glacial overseas. So a key humility to maintain as an analyst is that we'll never know the size of the illicit cannabis market at this point. Nobody's reporting it. They're in fact trying to hide it very carefully. So we'll never know the size, but my best guess at this point is that about $200 billion is being spent worldwide.
And that $200 billion that's being spent worldwide right now is really only catering to a small slice of what the full potential of cannabis is.
Or even what it is today, when you think about how much of it, of cannabis consumption does not involve transactions at all, because it's a barter economy, or it's just people growing their own, of course, which is happening, in parts of the world where you wouldn't dare transact cannabis, but it's being consumed. So the potential goes way beyond that, and we can get into that. But in any case, with just that 200 billion being spent around the world so far, is the key thing that points to how important these international markets are going to be to the overall cannabis business long term. I can't think of another product category in which North America represents more than 85% of the spending currently. That's just crazy. After 40 years of globalization and income equalization and progress around the world, with middle classes forming in countries that didn't have them before, there really isn't a product category I can think of where that's true. The U.S. still leads in the development of many product categories. Look at smartphones, for example, or video games, or home video, or pay TV, or whatever. It typically gets the ball rolling. But in terms of spending, it's quickly eclipsed by the sheer number of active consumers everywhere else in the world. So in most categories, North America is well under half of spending at this point. And I just noticed that the the theatrical box office for last year, only a quarter of the 43 billion spent on going to the movies last year was spent in North America. So that's the upside for the international markets. Once we can get really kind of the next 5 years of halting progress towards medical being available in most countries, at which point I think governments will start getting relaxed about the harms issue. They'll be getting very used to the tax revenue that they were foregoing by allowing it to remain an illicit market that they couldn't tax. And we'll really see the explosion around the world in that next 5-year period after 2025. And that's why it's so important for companies to get started now and be in place and ready to go when the fuse gets lit on what will be a rocket.
So this paints a really, really exciting picture from my activist point of view, as well as my entrepreneurial point of view. 5 years ago, there wasn't a global cannabis market. It didn't exist. Today, it can be measured in the billions of dollars. But what we're seeing is that internationally, we are just in the earliest stages of reform. In the United States, we, in the course of 20 years or so, since the passage of the first significant cannabis reform legislation, we've seen the progress from just a few very limited medical cannabis laws to basically wide open cannabis economies that are becoming really important parts of the mainstream economy. So it says to me that the same process will happen around the world. Like you said, Tom, when we introduce medical cannabis, even if it's introduced in a very limited kind of way, over time, people who never would have used cannabis before start consuming it. And once they do that, they usually have transformational medical experiences. And then they give that news, that good news, to their friends, to their doctors, to their families. And frequently, these are people also who never would have had anything to do with cannabis. And so over a course of 5 or 10 or 15 years, you see this very, very significant reduction in the amount of stigma and a new political opening to move from just medical cannabis into a fully free and legal cannabis market. So you saw this happen in Colorado. You want to tell us a little bit about what it looked like there?
Sure. What I, as you were ticking off the people they tell, I was going to add husbands. I think women are critical to this and have proven to be so in Colorado and every place else that I've seen consumer studies done. They tend to have been slightly less in the consumer category before legalization came along. They then, they probably tried it in their college days or before starting families or whatever. And of course, what we're hearing anecdotally and seeing in the data is how they're embracing, especially the new forms of cannabis consumption, the topicals, the edibles, the chocolates, the things that make sense to them as something you would consume, and start getting those wellness benefits that they cite in the studies as what's the value to them. And so, for example, in BDSA studies, we've seen the consuming percentage of the population in Colorado go from, I forget the exact numbers, but mid 20% to low 40% of the population, of the adult population in the state, since 2017. So not even, we don't even know what it was in 2014 when adult use kicked off, but it was less than 25%, certainly. So we've seen something like a doubling of the population that consumes cannabis when you get some years under your belt of despite some of the claims you see from the forces against legalization, no serious increases in traffic fatalities, to the extent it reduces alcohol consumption. Of course, you get a reduction in all sorts of health problems. It's a generally a positive, and that becomes obvious to people over time. And the longer it's been legal, the more that's obvious to everybody, and the more relaxed they can get about further legalization. So we're seeing it in Colorado. We've seen it in Colorado for many years now. We're in year 6 or 7 here of adult legalization. We're seeing it in California in year 3 of adult legalization. We're going to see it again in Massachusetts and Illinois and states that were later to the party. And we're starting to see it internationally in countries like Germany, which is now in year 3 of its medical experiment. And again, seeing none of the downsides people were worried about and all of the upsides in terms of people's health and wellness. So I think it's this is the process we're inevitably going to see it. I mean, it's clear after 8,000 years or whatever number you want to pick of human consumption of cannabis that the harms are not what people have claimed they are for the past 80 years. It's hard to remember that prohibition's only 80 years old, but it is. And prior to that, of course, it was in patent medicines and kind of everywhere in many societies, and even, pretty well established in the U.S. and elsewhere. So we're headed back to that and more, because now there's, of course, an organized industry behind it that will do it right. It will not be, snake oil on the back of a cart pulling into the town square to see what they can offload. It'll be a legitimate retailer selling something that has legitimate uses. So it's exciting to kind of, as I said, you can't predict the future, but some things are pretty clear from studying the past, and that's one of them, that this process was very likely to play out around the world at this point.
So this phenomenon may be surprising to prohibitionists, but it's certainly not surprising at all to those of us who love cannabis and know the plant. I mean, surprise, 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 knock me over with a feather. When you make cannabis legal, when you reduce the stigma, when you make it more readily available to people, more people try it. And when they try it, they like it and they incorporate it into their lives. And then good things happen in the world in general, right? These are all things that we know, but your work in being able to quantify them gives us the kind of data, the kind of hard evidence that we need to march into the halls of Congress, to go into legislatures, to confront the skeptics. It's very easy for us who love cannabis to convince ourselves of our own truths. But that's not who we need to convince. We have a whole world out there of cannabis skeptics that we need to convince. And in order to convince them, we need hard, good, solid evidence. And so it's just, I think the work that you've been doing is so important, not just to business, but to the cannabis community in general, Tom. What countries do you think are going to go next? Right now, we have a global cannabis economy that's dominated mostly by medical cannabis and by CBD. Do you think there's going to be other countries, well, which other countries do you think are going to come online next with really more open, full cannabis economies?
Yeah, that's the key distinction. There's actually revenue being generated by cannabinoids in almost every major country. The top 40 economies in the world at this point, in any case. But the key thing is when do they start? When do they move beyond pharmaceuticals? And of course, many of those pharmaceuticals are synthetic and not much of interest to people because they're pretty horrible drugs. So that's the key is the gradual. It's not the creation of medical cannabis; it's the expansion of medical cannabis to truly cannabis, particularly flower products and the derivatives therefrom. So it's what we're seeing is that real growth comes with real cannabis. So a classic example is France. France has long had the pharmaceuticals. Nobody wants them. They're allowed for spasticity and with Sativex, and doctors often prescribe it for pain relief too, because of course it does work for that. But it's pure THC and without any of the other ingredients that we know make cannabis effective in many ways. So France is probably next. They were due to start a pilot program with 2,000 patients this year. It got postponed until January because of COVID. But it looks like that will be a well-run, very tightly controlled by the government and carefully studied pilot program that, if history is any judge, will prove there's efficacy and no harm. And we'll have one of the largest economies in Europe now join the largest economy in Europe, Germany, as a full-blown medical program with real cannabis in pharmacies. So that's a 2-year pilot, so it's not going to move quickly. That pilot will be all that happens for the next 2 years. But after that, we're expecting France to move pretty quickly because, again, it's obviously a heavy cannabis consuming culture and just waiting to move into real stores with real products. So that's a big one. Another one showing some huge progress in the last couple of years has been the UK. I guess that's the second biggest economy in Europe, I think. And just kind of a phenomenal thing happened last year where the people rose up and just demanded of their representatives that they get the hell out of the way of these kids that were suffering without their cannabis. And to me, that kind of says everything about the chances for legalization everywhere. If the Brits are going to take their politicians by the scruff of the neck and kick them around until they do what they're told, that can happen in a lot of countries. Unfortunately, not every country, but a lot of countries. So there's been a lot of progress, therefore, with clinics popping up around the country to service the needs of patients for cannabis outside the state-run system, which is moving slowly to provide cannabis. But it's proving an effective way to get out there with doctors working with patients and prescribing cannabis where it's appropriate. So it's kind of a whole new model in the UK, and looks like a very positive one for a lot of countries. They're going to want to leave this in the hands of doctors for the time being, but to get around the nationalized health systems in many cases is going to be a positive. On the other hand, of course, the nationalized health systems is going to be a positive in countries that have it too, because they're covering the cost of it. So people tend to use more of something when they have the cost covered for them. So it works both ways, but there's many different models evolving now, and countries are kind of free to take their pick with a lot of experience to go by in a year or two. Right now, they have just Germany to kind of look at as a model. So that's interesting developments in the UK. And then things are moving along in a lot of other countries. A lot of Latin America has had very limited cannabis access, where you can order finished products from countries that have legalized cannabis, but there's no pipeline set up within the country to provide treatments to people. And so Brazil and Argentina and Peru and others in South America are slowly getting past that point just this year, really, and starting to put in place the moves to import cannabis, raw cannabis into the country, make the products there, and adopt in many cases the formulating pharmacist approach that Europe has really had much more than the U.S. has always had for all drugs, but is proving to be very perfect for cannabis, in that you're talking about a doctor being able to give specific instructions about what he thinks the patient would benefit most from, and the pharmacist formulating it right there on site from raw ingredients, and really thereby being able to tailor the medicine to the patient in a way that is challenging especially in a pharmaceutical industry where there's so many rules and regulations around everything. So that's a positive general development on the medical front in a couple of the countries that are likely to move and be big just because they're such big countries.
When I think about the information that you just shared, Tom, for me, this is really a challenge to cannabis activists all over the world. Come on, tribe. The picture that Tom is painting is a picture that's going to take years and decades to accomplish our goal of getting cannabis legally and safely into the hands of everybody on this planet who needs it. Yes, it will work. Yes, we know that when we introduce medical cannabis to countries like France, that over time, people have more experience with the plant and more vistas of reform are opened up. But that takes a long time. In the United States, it's taken almost 25 years. And people are dying and suffering. People are going to prison for every single day of every single one of those years. We know now that we have the data. It has been shown that legalizing cannabis only brings positive benefits to society, not a small little incremental medical dispensation, but full-blown real legalization. And that's what we need to move for. We know that it's possible now. And my plea to the cannabis tribe is, could you prove Tom wrong? Could you get out there and re-energize, to recommit to full legalization, to do what the people in the UK did, to go to your politicians, to pick them up by the scruffs of their necks, to drag them down to the legislature and make them do their jobs. So come on, team. Let's get this one done, and let's get it done in something less than 3 decades, okay?
Steve, if I could jump in there, the interesting country on that front right now is Mexico. Mexico has had the legislature did move to legalize medical, and it's gone very, very slowly. And in a unique thing that I'm not sure is in anybody else's constitution around the world, the Supreme Court can actually order Congress to make laws. And so it's very complicated. It takes 5 different rulings in 5 different cases, apparently, but it happened finally that a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court ordered the government of Mexico to legalize adult use, saying that it was unconstitutional to deprive people of their cannabis. And that's the good news, is a new method, legalization method unheard of, developed in Mexico. The bad news is what's happened since, of course, that the Mexican legislature has dragged its feet and had more hearings than action, and just this year has missed several deadlines for getting it done, according to the Supreme Court. And of course, as a court, it has no real enforcement ability to force Congress to really do it. So in talking to folks down there just recently, it's just kind of a moment of almost despair that this could never get done. But it is in the law that it has to happen, and therefore I think will happen. And with more involvement and a bigger percentage of the population really pushing it and twisting arms with legislatures, that's what it's going to take. And not just in Mexico, but everywhere around the world. And then I think another critical country to look at is so tiny, it's almost, hesitate to bring it up, but Luxembourg. Luxembourg is just right in the heart of Europe. It's just exactly, it's right there between Germany and France, and it's similar populations, the richest country in the world, one of them by GDP per capita, and it's going legal adult. And I think that's going to be so critical, because if it happens right there in the heart of Europe, that you could move from a very limited medical regime into a full-blown adult use legalization situation, and no harm comes to anybody because of it, that's going to change a lot of minds in Europe.
Luxembourg is about to become a very popular place in Europe. Tom, one of the things that we've seen as the industries. Oh, wait a minute, Tom. I want to just take a moment to recognize the cannabis activist in Mexico. I think that you're absolutely right. I'm completely 100% certain that cannabis is going to be legalized in Mexico, and it's because of the ferocity and determination of the Mexican cannabis activist community. Some of the most determined, creative, and unstoppable activists that I've met in my half century of cannabis activism are my Mexican sisters and brothers. So a big salute, a big abrazo to all of our friends down in Mexico. I know that you're going to get this done. Tom, one of the troubling things that we've seen it here in California, certainly, and I've seen it in Colombia and other places that I've traveled around the world, is that as cannabis is legalized, the legal companies that are backed by big investors, that have a sophisticated ability to raise capital, to get licenses, to engage with the government, are claiming the lion's share of the legal economy. And the traditional people who are producing cannabis underground, sometimes for many, many generations, their families have depended on it for their livelihoods, are now being squeezed out of the industry. You go to the Emerald Triangle in Northern California, and there's families who have had to call their kids home from college. There's families who have had to sell their properties, farms that have been in the family for 3 generations. There are boarded up storefronts in some of what used to be really prosperous small towns. And I see the same thing in Colombia, where the government has actually passed a regulation that forbids anybody who used to grow in a conflict zone during the Civil War from participating in the legal cannabis industry. And of course, most of the cannabis during that period of time was grown in conflict zones by subsistence farmers, by campesinos, by people who didn't have very much of an alternative, and now that's being taken from them. Where do you see this pattern being most dominant, and are there any countries that are taking steps to reverse it, to try and build a more inclusive industry?
Yeah, it's tough to look at this from a California perspective and keep any perspective, of course, because California is certainly the poster child for this. The EIR that the state produced on the for the legal program estimated that there's about 13.5 million pounds of cannabis grown in California, that the legal medical market of 2017 only needed about 600,000 of those, that about 1.9 million of it was consumed through illicit channels in California, leaving 11 million of it going outside of California. And, as far as Mexico City, I was stunned to hear when I got into the business that California cannabis is popular in Mexico City.
It's popular in Bombay, man.
Globalization has reached into every sector. There's no doubt about it. So, but in any case, so that really sets California up to be perhaps the hardest suffering of the traditional cannabis markets with the arrival of legalization, coupled with the fact that it was such an attractive market for outside investors. And this is a classic case, of course, of the common wisdom, being wrong, and why you need analysts to have the ability to, as one of my Hollywood guys said, Tom, you have the advantage. You can go close your door and think for a minute. So if you thought about it, you might have seen this coming in California. And we did. We tried to be cautious in our projections for California, but even we didn't get right the fact that it would actually shrink in spending between 2017 and 18 legally, because the regulatory and tax load was just so heinous that the illicit cannabis became super attractive to everybody who knew where to go get it. So it's been a real challenge in California, and it's one that's going to be replicated everywhere because every country in the world grows cannabis at this point, except maybe the most northern climes, or southern, I guess. And so we're going to see it happen over and over again, and really been very little attention paid to it by anybody. And that's one of the real threats of letting this develop for a long time as a medical only program, as opposed to just cutting to the chase and making cannabis legal, where the market could sort of, the current players in the market could participate and, take their chances, but at least have a shot of maintaining a decent share of the market, as happened, frankly, with alcohol prohibition ending, right? A lot of bootleggers ended up being the major players in the business. So that's hard to see happening if we take years or, God forbid, decades to get through the medical only era and into adult use legalization. But it is starting to be to show up in a couple of countries. Jamaica, I heard you talk about it, and you probably know more than I do about what's going on in Jamaica. But just the idea of setting up a separate set of rules for the Rastafarians to take care of their own through barter and or legalized activity, cannabis activity. It's just a great thing to see. And admittedly, Jamaica perhaps has the most out front and ingrained into the society cannabis culture in the world. So, but where else would you see it happen and kind of have the test case set up for other countries to follow? So I think it's very heartening to see what the Jamaicans are doing. It's also pretty heartening to talk to some of the activists in Mexico and seeing at least what they're pushing down there, which is an effort to bring in this massive infrastructure, essentially, of cannabis growing campesinos around the country into the legitimate trade as it goes legal. So we'll see if that gets adopted, or whether the higher ups in the government decide that no, we'd rather do business with the equivalent of American oil companies. That didn't work out really well for Latin America over the decades. So perhaps they'll see the light when it comes to cannabis and really try and make it more of a homegrown phenomenon and keep the traditional participants in the business. So we haven't seen a lot of effort go that direction yet, though. So it's definitely something to be everybody to be watching for.
Well, I can tell you that the members of this tribe, the audience of this podcast, do understand the need to protect our traditional, our indigenous, our legacy growers from all over the world. Part of that just goes to fairness. It just goes to distribution of the riches, right? Who is going to end up benefiting from this industry? the people who carried the plant through the long, dark years of Prohibition, who had the helicopters landing on their property, who fought the battles? Or is it going to go to corporate masters, to an investor class that didn't bear any of the burden of that struggle? So part of this is about a division of the wealth that is going to be created. But there's another aspect to this, and I think of it as a struggle for the soul of the cannabis industry. If we have a long, protracted period of time where the only cannabis is medical cannabis, where it has to be heavily, heavily, heavily regulated at all times, where change is incremental, and where the scene becomes dominated by big corporations, then we also are going to be squeezing out the people who came to this plant not because they want to make money off of it, because they understand it, because they love it, because they believe that it came into our hands to help us change ourselves, to heal the nations, to heal the planet. And we, the people who love this plant, are the people who really understand it and know it best, and are most capable of introducing it, of explaining, of teaching the rest of the world that's beginning to discover it now what the most important parts of cannabis are, to familiarize themselves with the culture of tolerance and inclusivity and peace and love and sustainability that has sprung up around this plant. Are those the kind of people that are going to teach the world about cannabis? Or are we going to be taught by marketing firms that are hired by huge corporations that are so big, that have so many stakeholders, that they're actually really forbidden from taking any kind of clear activist action or anything out of altruistic intent? So again, a challenge to the cannabis tribe around the world. We cannot allow our sisters and brothers who have been carrying this plant through Prohibition all of these years to be squeezed out. We cannot allow the promise of a new industry that will spread the wealth more widely, that will actually be sustainable and fair. We can't allow that to be taken by the standard corporate world. It's a super important mission. And I know you're all out there fighting for it now. Just a little reminder about how important it is. Tom, before we leave, I want to get a little peek behind all of this data and analysis and talk about Tom Adams, the person. You grew up in California during a really interesting and pivotal time when, and I grew up basically the same time on the East Coast and saw much the same thing. You know, in my earliest days with cannabis, it was all imported. First cannabis that I saw was imported from Mexico, then Jamaica, then Colombia, then Thailand. And it wasn't until there were several years of imported cannabis consumption that we started seeing the creation of a domestic cultivation industry. And that industry was born in California, where you were growing up. So what did that period of time look like from your point of view? It must have been a wonderful time to be a cannabis consumer.
Yeah, I guess I had the pretty typical experience for a Californian. Maybe I was a little more, conservatively raised in Catholic schools in San Diego and LA in the 60s and 70s. So my first encounter with cannabis was really at a dorm party, night one at UC Santa Cruz. One of the Marin kids invited everybody up to his room to encounter what I had never heard of before, a bong. And his was made out of one of those canisters of Tootsie Rolls, where you used to be able to buy a tube of Tootsie Rolls, and he had converted it into a bong. My friend, wherever you are. But probably the most interesting thing for me about all of this was getting to Santa Cruz in the late 70s there and encountering Rob Clark, who you mentioned, and I know is a friend of yours. Robert C. Clark, author of Marijuana Botany way back then. That was actually his senior thesis. You had to write a thesis to graduate from Santa Cruz in those days. even with a BA. And he talked and you could design your own major. So he talked one of the bio professors into backing his study of marijuana botany and put out that very seminal book, of course, in the late 70s, early 80s. So, and of course, he kind of introduced all of us to the joys of homegrown, as it was called in those days. Sensimilla, as a investment banker at a recent ARQ conference, said to me, "What's sensimilla?" And as you can imagine, I felt my age at that point. You don't remember there being seeds in cannabis, huh? But we did, and of course, encountering 8-inch beautiful colas of seedless green fragrant cannabis was just an amazing experience for all of us, and especially with how bad that imported stuff had gotten by that point. If I'm sure you recall what we used to call the seeds and stem, the bird's nest baggie of seeds and stems from Mexico that was not an attractive product. Let's put it that way. So anyway, very much through Rob, kind of got introduced to what cannabis could be, and had some wonderful experiences with him, figuring out how at one point, not being very good businessmen at that point, and much smarter now, we thought the 1,000 plants that we were going to grow in the Santa Cruz Hills would be pretty much what the state needed, being the collector he was, of course, he had a phenomenal collection of seeds from around the world, all those imports, even the black Afghani hash yielded a seed or two that yielded a little 4-foot, Afghani Hindu Kush plant. And so there was a veritable Garden of Eden to walk through a patch that Rob put together. And so we definitely, you're right. We got to see the interesting evolution of cannabis. I loved your story about discovering Santa Marta Gold. I heard you talk about it at one point. We must have been getting the West Coast variety of Colombian, because there was nothing beautiful about it. It was crushed and powdery and not very attractive. And that's why, of course, I've loved Rob's book, his hashish book, where he has in the back an appendix of interesting hashish that arrived in the California market in the 70s and 80s. And he's got them all cataloged by, what the stamp on the outside of the burlap bag was, and, the various characteristics of the different hash. So it's something to look forward to in the future of worldwide cannabis market. It occurs to me is the ability to ship cannabis products around the world and see what's happened to them in the meantime. And more importantly, try and revive some of the landrace strains and deliver them to people around the world and get some variety back into a product category that's suffered a sort of a sameness in the 20, 30 years since then, as people focused on, we got to get it in the ground and we got to get it out before we get busted, and we want it to weigh as much as we possibly can. And we've ended up with, kind of a hybridization into sameness that, I think we can recover from as an industry, and seeing what happened has happened in many other industries, beer, the most classic example. The consumer is going to love it, and we can get back there when true legalization comes around the world. So it's an exciting prospect.
I'm so looking forward to that. You're right. One of the few benefits of being on the East Coast relative to California in those days is that we were closer to Colombia. So we got it fresh and we got the pick, and we smoked all the good stuff before it got to California, man. Partly. I certainly, it was, the Santa Marta Gold that you reference was the very first cannabis that I made a significant amount of money on. It really got my career off to a great start. So, you after school, you eventually get into this career where you're engaging with a lot of corporate folks, pretty high-powered corporate work. Your cannabis star was fixed at an early age, but then you're, navigating through this corporate world. What was it like being a cannabis consumer in that world in those days?
Well, keep in mind, of course, this was Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and Wall Street, three corners of the economy that are pretty accepting of drug use. and in fact, maybe too accepting, given all the cocaine abuse that was rampant in those three sectors of the economy in the 80s and 90s. So, but you're right. There was still very much a stigma. It was, it was still a very much us versus them world, if you recall. I remember making fun of Nancy Reagan's Just Say No program by noting that given her own proclivities, she must have meant just say no to non-prescription drugs. And we thought that was pretty cute. And so, but yeah, it was Hollywood, Silicon Valley, Wall Street again, where people are more, both accepting in the sense and therefore more generously hearted, but also pretty cynical. And therefore, it was just kind of not talked about as it is even in, Alabama and other states where it's not as open as it is in those industries. But just sort of kept under wraps is what you had to do, so it's a real pleasure to get into the cannabis industry where it's just a very different culture entirely. I think you maybe said it best at the early ArtView conference I went to, where you looked around the room and saw the growing percentage. I always call it the tie-dye versus tie ratio, and the tie-dye, the ratio was dropping at that point that you made that speech, and noted that, hey, everybody, corporate America is coming and it's going to change the cannabis industry. Let's just hope cannabis can change corporate America as much. And I just thought that was a hugely perceptive way to look at what could happen and the good outcome this could all have.
Well, I think that process is happening. Many of the people who come to the ArcView conferences, I can't tell you how many of them at some point in my relationship with them have cornered me, sort of taken me over to a private corner and said, Steve, when I first started doing this cannabis thing, I was just in it for the money. That's all I cared about. And I'm like, oh, no, I would have never thought that, right? And then they go, but now that I've been working with it for a few years, I've invested in a few companies, I've spent time with patients who are using cannabis, and I've seen the incredible good that it brings to people's lives. I've seen how people have just had these amazing transformations for the better, in some cases their lives saved. And I'm a true believer now, man. I'm all in. And I'd say at least half of the time when I go to them to write a nice check for the Last Prisoner Project, they do it.
Well, and since you have the activist crowd and the new activist crowd that thought they were in it just for the money, we're now becoming activists listening in. It occurs to me that there's a current issue around this that's absolutely central to good outcomes here, and that's mandatory testing in corporations and governments and around the world. There's still this stigma attached to cannabis, whereby if you're tested positive on your drug test, you're fired, and that has just got to end. It'll end, I think, slowly but surely, because clearly with legalization and more cannabis consumption, you're going to find out that alcohol use, of course, is a far greater threat to the health and safety of the world than cannabis is, and we're tolerating that, and we're not even testing for alcohol use. I guess if you're blatantly drunk driving a forklift, you might get caught and canned, but it's not systematic that you're being tested for other far more troublesome chemicals. So it shows up, for example, in the Canadian data, where the highest medical card percentage in the country was in Alberta, where the oil field workers have mandatory testing, and so they were ecstatic to be able to finally go and get a medical card, and in a legal regime that said it was okay to have cannabis if your doctor said it was, be able to go take the test positive, and say, that was last night or last weekend, and I'm not on the job stoned, and you got no right to fire me. So it's it can happen in that very jury-rigged way through medical legalization, but it can really only happen through adult use and full legalization, and that's why it's important to move on quickly around the world.
Ultimately, we are going to have the real debate about cannabis, not about cannabis prohibition and how harmful it is, not about is cannabis just a little harm that we can deal with and we can live with, but the real question Is cannabis a good plant, or, if you believe in such things, a bad plant? Is it something that we should welcome into our lives, into our families, and into our societies? Or is it something that we should ban and something that we should push away? We know that every time that we have an evidence-based conversation on that question, it comes back in favor of cannabis. Um, Tom, I want to close here with doing a little double check, right? I talk a lot about the idea of a global cannabis culture, of a cannabis tribe, the idea that hundreds of millions of us all around the world who all have endocannabinoid systems have had the same set of experiences with this plant. And out of those experiences, we've developed a commonality, a shared value system. And that scope, right? There's hundreds of millions of us around the world. Collectively, we're larger than any nation, or all but the largest nations on earth. And I think about that. One of the purposes of this podcast is to introduce this community to each other. How have you seen that manifesting in your work? Is there such a thing as a global cannabis culture or consciousness?
Well, I think so. I mean, clearly there's communities both in the traditional market and now growing up in the legal market that are very much communities and have a shared ethos for that reason. Yeah. So it varies country by country, state by state. Somebody in Colorado said to me at one point when I first got involved, well, you've got to come out here and see what's going on in Colorado. You're from California. We don't have any of that hippie ethos out here. We're just a bunch of aggressive entrepreneurs looking at the next main chance, right? And so, of course, that's wrong. There's something of the hippie ethos in the hills of Colorado as well. So I think whether you call it that, the hippie ethos or cannabis culture, clearly, it's happening. And I think it all goes kind of back to what the function of the endocannabinoid system in the human body is. It's just that basic, that it is in charge of maintaining homeostasis, and that neither too hot nor too cold, nor too fast nor too slow, nor as I think maybe the fabulous Furry Freak Brothers said back in the day, it mellows you out, and that's a kind of a disreputable word at this point. But I think it's okay to use it with this crowd to suggest that there's a certain mellowing effect of consuming cannabis that everybody who does appreciates. And that's what creates that separate culture, which, hopefully will not be all that separate and be more integrated into the broader culture pretty quickly here.
Yeah, that was that point that I made back at that ArcView conference is, are the corporations going to corporatize cannabis, or is cannabis going to cannibize the corporations? The jury's still out on that one, but I think that we all know that the best way to get to the conclusion is to get as much cannabis into the hands of as many people as we can. Tom, just in the last minute or two here that we have together, what's on your horizon? What should we be looking from you next? And how can our audience stay in touch with you?
Well, we're just getting started on getting up a website, Adams Cannabis Research, but you can go ahead and give us your information if you want to hear about what's coming up from us next. The opportunity of doing this talk with you has convinced me I need to sit down and kind of write up some of this stuff I've been learning in the last couple of months about the international markets. So there'll be, some blog posting on that front that'll make it worth reading about. I'm approaching a lot of the key companies in the business that I think are on the right track or could be on the right track and could use a smart strat planner to help them get on the right track. Having, for example, first help Blockbuster take over the world and then help Netflix take over from Blockbuster, and help, Disney and the other studios revolutionize the media business, and the tech companies figure out personal handy telephones and what they were going to mean to everybody. I think I've got a lot to offer some of the smart companies in the business. So I'll be hopefully working with a lot of them. And then I'm talking to some of the other folks that are really have done some pioneering work on really getting Wall Street involved in this business, which we need, as much as they are suit wearers. We need their capital, we need their support to make this happen. And so we're talking about various ways of bringing together all of the good investor interest data into some easy way for people to access that. So again, I promise I won't spam you with yet another news summary every week. It'll just be smart stuff that occurred to me because of all the research we're doing. And again, you can hear about it by signing up at Adams Cannabis Research.
Great. All right. Well, Tom, thank you so much for being with us here today. I come out of this conversation with you really appreciative of how far we've come since those early days when I was a young activist and could find literally almost no information about cannabis. It was hidden. It had been purged. It was unfindable. I mean, I went and when I found the books, I'm not lying, they would have whole chapters cut out of them, right? And now, today, we have really super talented professionals who have spent their whole lives looking at a variety of different industries and sectors, who are devoting all of their time and all of their energy to understanding on a very detailed level, actually, the real life things that are happening. And this is so critical moving forward, that we have the ability, not just as entrepreneurs and investors, to make smart business decisions, but that activists all around this planet have the data that they need to show one simple truth. Legalizing cannabis is good for everybody, not just people who consume cannabis, but the benefits flow through to society on all different levels. So, Tribe, I encourage you all to stay in touch with the work that Tom is doing, to look upon it as ammunition in the struggles that we will be fighting, to make sure that traditional cannabis producers have a place in this industry, struggles that we'll be fighting to make sure that whole plant medicine is accessible to people all around the world, struggles that we'll be fighting to make sure that we can actually move from the medicalization of cannabis to full freedom. This is how we win, with evidence and fact-based argument. It's easy to convince each other. It's more difficult to convince the world. Tom, thank you so much for giving us the data, the ammunition, the facts, the evidence that we need to go into the arena of debate and come out victorious.